I watched my fuel fall faster than the distance would close. The radio answered me with static, and the system kept its silence. When the engine gave me no more margin, I put the aircraft into the water and waited. In the dark, the shapes below circled, and I understood what routine had cost. By early August 1943, the Pacific War had entered its second full year of sustained carrier and land-based air operations across vast ocean distances. The United States Navy was expanding its reach south and west of Hawaii, supporting island campaigns that depended heavily on continuous aerial patrols. Long overwater flights had become routine. They were no longer considered exceptional assignments, but a daily requirement of maintaining control over sea lanes, reconnaissance corridors, and submarine approaches. On the morning of August 6, 1943, Naval Air Station Kaneohe Bay on the eastern shore of Oahu was operating on its usual wartime schedule. Aircraft were launched in staggered intervals. Maintenance crews rotated through inspection lines, and pilots attended briefings that focused on navigation accuracy and fuel management rather than enemy contact. The central operational concern that day was range. Patrol aircraft were being pushed to the outer limits of their endurance, a necessity dictated by the distances involved rather than any change in doctrine. The Pacific Fleet's air arm had learned by experience that mechanical reliability was not guaranteed over open water. Engines that performed acceptably near land often behaved differently after hours of sustained flight at steady revolutions. Navigation depended on dead reckoning, celestial fixes, and radio beacons that were not always reliable at extreme range. Rescue coverage existed, but it was thin, uneven, and highly dependent on weather and timing. Among the pilots assigned to that day's patrol rotation were 3 junior naval aviators flying as separate elements of the same long-range sweep. All 3 were qualified, current, and considered competent by their squadron commanders. None were veterans of major carrier battles, but each had accumulated enough flight hours to be trusted with extended over-water missions. The senior of the 3 was a lieutenant, junior grade, in his mid-20s, recently reassigned from training duty to operational patrol work. His prior weeks had been spent flying routine search arcs, scanning empty ocean for signs of surface vessels or submarine wakes. His logbooks showed long stretches of uneventful flights, punctuated only by weather deviations or minor equipment discrepancies noted after landing. The second pilot, slightly younger, had arrived in Hawaii only months earlier. He had completed advanced flight training on the mainland and was still adjusting to Pacific conditions. His aircraft handling was sound, but his experience with long-duration navigation was limited to training exercises rather than operational patrols. His squadron instructors had noted this, but there was little time for gradual acclimation. Operational demand outweighed ideal preparation. The third pilot was the most junior, recently designated as a naval aviator and assigned to patrol duty almost immediately. He had demonstrated strong basic flying skills, but had yet to encounter the cumulative strain of extended missions over open ocean. His presence on the patrol schedule reflected the Navy's ongoing need to fill flight rosters as rapidly as possible. Their aircraft were standard patrolled and utility types used widely across the Pacific at that stage of the war. They were not designed for combat engagement, but for endurance, visibility, and steady flight profiles. The aircraft carried life rafts, emergency rations, and signal equipment in accordance with regulations. These provisions were considered adequate under existing planning assumptions. Those assumptions rested on 2 expectations. First, that aircraft would generally be able to return to base even if forced to reduce power or divert. Second, that if an aircraft did go down, its position would likely be known closely enough for surface or air rescue to respond within a reasonable time frame. Neither assumption had been fully tested under the expanding operational radius now required.
Weather reports that morning indicated moderate trade winds and scattered cloud layers, with visibility expected to remain good. Sea conditions were described as manageable, with no immediate storm systems forecast along the patrol routes. These assessments contributed to a sense of routine rather than urgency in the pre-flight briefings. Each pilot received a similar navigation plan with assigned headings, time intervals, and fuel checkpoints. Radio contact procedures were reviewed, emphasizing brevity and discipline to avoid unnecessary transmissions. No mention was made of search and rescue limitations beyond the standard advisories that rescue assets might be delayed depending on location. The patrols launched without incident. One by one, the aircraft lifted off Kaneohe Bay, climbed to cruising altitude, and turned toward assigned sectors of the Pacific. For the first several hours, their flights unfolded as planned. Engines held steady. Navigation fixes aligned with expectations. The ocean below offered little variation beyond shifting patterns of light and cloud shadow. As the hours passed, small discrepancies began to emerge. One pilot noted a gradual increase in oil temperature, still within acceptable limits but trending upward. Another observed fuel consumption slightly higher than calculated, a difference small enough to dismiss individually but notable over long distance. Radio reception became inconsistent at extended range. Static increased, and signals from shore stations faded in and out. The pilots relied more heavily on compass headings and time calculations. This was expected, but it reduced margin for correction if conditions deviated further. None of the pilots encountered enemy vessels or aircraft. The patrols yielded no sightings worth reporting. From an operational standpoint, the missions appeared successful. The absence of contact reinforced the sense that these flights were primarily exercises in persistence rather than risk. But it was during the return legs, as fuel reserves diminished and fatigue set in, that limitations became more pronounced. Minor mechanical issues that had seemed tolerable earlier took on greater significance. A slight vibration in one aircraft's engine became more noticeable. Another pilot found that maintaining altitude required marginally higher power settings than anticipated. Navigation fixes taken late in the flights were less precise. Cloud cover interfered with celestial observations, and radio bearings remained unreliable. The pilots adjusted headings incrementally, trusting that their calculations remained within acceptable error margins. By the time each aircraft turned toward what should have been the final leg back to Oahu, the margin for error had narrowed. Fuel reserves were no longer generous. Engine performance was adequate, but no longer reassuring. The ocean below remained unchanged, offering no visual cues to confirm position. These conditions did not yet constitute an emergency. Similar situations had been resolved many times before, with aircraft returning safely after conservative power adjustments or minor course corrections. The pilots continued according to procedure, maintaining steady flight and monitoring instruments closely. What was becoming evident, however, was the fragility of the systems supporting such missions. Small deviations in fuel burn, navigation accuracy, or engine behavior could compound over hundreds of miles of open water. Rescue planning assumed timely reporting and relatively precise location data, both of which were increasingly uncertain as radio contact degraded. As the afternoon progressed, each pilot faced decisions that were routine on paper but more complex in practice. Whether to maintain altitude or descend to conserve fuel, whether to adjust course based on imperfect fixes, whether to report concerns early or wait until limits were clearly exceeded. None of these choices appeared dramatic at the time. They were the quiet calculations of experienced airmen operating within established doctrine. But the cumulative effect of distance, endurance, and limited redundancy was beginning to assert itself. By the final hour of flight, the Pacific remained empty in all directions. The expected sight of land had not yet appeared on the horizon. Instruments continued to function, but their readings carried less confidence than earlier in the day. Each aircraft pressed on, operating under the assumption that the margins still held. It was at this point, before any crisis had declared itself, that the underlying problem became clear. The Navy's expanding patrol reach was testing not only aircraft and crews, but the assumptions that governed their use. The system worked well when everything aligned. It offered little buffer when multiple small factors drifted in the wrong direction at once. The three pilots continued their return flights, unaware that the conditions they now faced would soon exceed the limits of routine procedure.
By late afternoon, the three aircraft were no longer operating under identical conditions, despite having departed on similar schedules and routes. Subtle differences in engine performance, fuel consumption, and navigation error had begun to separate their situations. What had started as routine patrol flights were now individual efforts to reconcile calculations with an ocean that offered no confirmation. The senior pilot was the first to recognize that his margin was shrinking faster than anticipated. Fuel gauges, never precise instruments, indicated remaining endurance that no longer matched his mental estimates. He recalculated based on time elapsed and power settings, arriving at figures that suggested he should already be closer to land. The absence of visual confirmation introduced doubt into every assumption. Radio contact with Kaneohe Bay was attempted at scheduled intervals. Each transmission was acknowledged only intermittently, often with delay or distortion. Bearings received in response were inconsistent, likely affected by atmospheric conditions and distance. The pilot logged the information mentally, but relied primarily on his own dead reckoning to adjust course. In the second aircraft, the younger pilot faced a different set of difficulties. His engine had begun to run unevenly at cruising power. Reducing throttle smoothed the vibration, but resulted in a gradual loss of airspeed. Increasing power restored speed, but brought back the irregular behavior. He settled on a compromise setting, accepting reduced progress in exchange for mechanical stability. This adjustment, while prudent in isolation, altered his fuel profile. Consumption dropped slightly, but so did ground speed. With no clear indication of wind drift, he could not determine whether he was gaining or losing relative to his intended track. Each correction was necessarily conservative, intended to avoid overcompensation. The most junior pilot encountered the least obvious but potentially most serious problem: uncertainty. His instruments showed no clear malfunction. Fuel readings appeared reasonable. Engine temperatures remained within limits. Yet his position fixes grew increasingly vague. Without reliable radio bearings or celestial references, he was forced to trust calculations derived from assumptions hours earlier. As daylight began to decline, the operational environment changed subtly but decisively. Cloud layers thickened at mid-altitudes, reducing contrast between sea and sky. The sun's lower angle made glare more pronounced in certain directions, complicating visual scanning. None of these factors were abnormal, but together they reduced situational awareness. Standard procedure called for pilots to report fuel concerns early enough to allow coordinated assistance. In practice, this guidance competed with ingrained habits of self-reliance. Declaring difficulty prematurely risked unnecessary diversion of limited rescue resources and potential scrutiny after landing. Waiting too long, however, reduced options. The senior pilot transmitted a brief status report indicating lower than expected fuel reserves. The response from shore was delayed and nonspecific, advising him to continue toward base and report further developments. No vector or definitive bearing was provided. The exchange did little to clarify his situation. In the second aircraft, the younger pilot chose not to report his engine irregularities immediately. The issue was manageable, and he judged that broadcasting mechanical concerns without clear evidence of imminent failure might complicate matters rather than help. He focused instead on maintaining steady flight and conserving fuel where possible. The junior pilot attempted multiple radio calls without response. Whether his transmissions were not received or replies were lost to interference was impossible to determine. He adjusted his course slightly, attempting to align with what he believed was the most likely return heading. Each adjustment carried risk, but inaction offered no better alternative. As the afternoon wore on, fatigue became a factor.
Hours of sustained concentration over uniform terrain taxed attention and judgment. Small tasks required more deliberate effort. Calculations that would normally be straightforward demanded repeated checking. The pilots remained alert, but the cumulative strain was evident. Fuel gauges in the senior pilot's aircraft approached levels that could no longer be ignored. He reduced power to extend endurance, accepting a slower rate of progress. This choice assumed that land was still ahead rather than behind or off to one side. Without confirmation, the assumption could not be verified. The second pilot noted that his engine behavior worsened slightly as fuel levels dropped. Whether this was coincidence or an early indication of a developing problem was unclear. He adjusted mixture settings carefully, mindful that abrupt changes could exacerbate the issue. His attention shifted increasingly from navigation to engine management. In the third aircraft, the junior pilot experienced a growing disconnect between expectation and observation. The horizon remained empty. The time since last reliable fix exceeded what he was comfortable with. He considered climbing to increase radio range, but rejected the idea due to fuel considerations. Descending offered no clear benefit. Repeated attempts to raise any station produced only static. Emergency frequencies were tried briefly, then abandoned to conserve power. The lack of response did not yet constitute an emergency under formal definitions, but it eroded confidence. As dusk approached, the pilots faced a narrowing set of options. Turning back was no longer viable. Fuel reserves would not support retracing their routes. Continuing forward without confirmation risked overshooting or missing land entirely. Holding course and altitude consumed fuel without guarantee of resolution. The senior pilot made another transmission, this time reporting a specific fuel state and estimated position. The reply, when it came, acknowledged receipt but offered no concrete guidance. Rescue assets were not immediately available in his sector. He was advised to prepare for further instructions. In the second aircraft, the engine's irregularity escalated into intermittent power loss. Each fluctuation was brief, but together they indicated a developing failure. The pilot reduced power further, prioritizing engine preservation over speed. This decision increased the likelihood that fuel would outlast the engine, but reduced the chance of reaching land before darkness. The junior pilot, still without radio contact, began preparing mentally for contingencies. He reviewed ditching procedures, checked the location of his life raft release, and ensured that emergency equipment was accessible. These actions were taken calmly as part of standard training, but their necessity underscored the seriousness of his situation. None of the pilots could see one another. The vastness of the Pacific ensured that their experiences remained isolated despite originating from the same operation. Each aircraft existed in its own narrow bubble of capability and uncertainty. Official doctrine assumed that extended patrols would occasionally result in forced landings, but it also assumed timely rescue facilitated by clear reporting and known positions. In practice, the combination of distance, radio limitations, and gradual system degradation challenged those assumptions. As daylight faded further, the distinction between routine difficulty and emergency blurred. Fuel reserves crossed thresholds that left little room for further calculation. Engine performance trends suggested that continued flight might not be sustainable. The senior pilot adjusted his harness and reviewed ditching checklists, still hoping to sight land before the decision became unavoidable. The second pilot monitored his engine closely, prepared to act if power loss became continuous. The junior pilot maintained course and altitude, scanning the horizon for any sign that would confirm his position. These were not dramatic moments in the conventional sense. There were no alarms, no sudden failures, no enemy action. Instead, there was a gradual accumulation of small deficiencies, each manageable alone but collectively decisive. By the time dusk began to encroach on the eastern horizon, all three pilots understood that their situation had moved beyond routine variation. The Pacific, indifferent and unmarked, offered no immediate resolution. The system that had carried them outward now struggled to bring them home.
Nightfall did not arrive abruptly. It advanced in stages, first reducing contrast along the horizon, then flattening the ocean's surface into a uniform dark field. For pilots accustomed to daylight navigation, this transition removed one of the last remaining references.
The sky and sea merged, leaving instruments as the primary source of orientation. The senior pilot was the first to cross a threshold that doctrine did not clearly define. His fuel calculations indicated that continued powered flight toward his estimated position of Oahu would leave no reserve. The gauges suggested minutes rather than hours of endurance. Any error in heading or distance would be unrecoverable. He transmitted a final detailed report stating fuel state, estimated position, and intention to continue briefly before reassessing. The reply, delayed and incomplete, acknowledged the transmission but provided no new information. Shore-based controllers could not reconcile his estimated position with their own plots, which were based on earlier, less precise reports. The gap between airborne reality and ground-based tracking had widened beyond easy correction. In the second aircraft, the situation deteriorated more visibly. The engine's intermittent power loss became more frequent. Each fluctuation forced small corrections to maintain altitude. The pilot compensated with throttle and mixture adjustments, but the underlying problem persisted. The engine had not failed outright, yet it no longer inspired confidence. The younger pilot made the decision to transmit a mechanical difficulty report. The call was brief, adhering to procedure, but it marked a departure from his earlier restraint. The response he received was limited. Acknowledgement, followed by advice to maintain best endurance settings and report further changes. There was no immediate prospect of assistance. The most junior pilot remained without radio contact. His situation differed in that no single system had clearly failed. Instead, uncertainty itself had become the dominant factor. He could not confirm his position, could not receive bearings, and could not reliably estimate time to landfall. His fuel state, while not yet critical, would become so within the hour. Training had emphasized that ditching decisions should be made before fuel exhaustion forced an uncontrolled descent. The guidance was clear in principle, but difficult to apply without position certainty. Ditching too early risked landing far from potential rescue routes. Waiting too long risked loss of control at low altitude. As darkness deepened, the pilots faced choices that were increasingly personal rather than procedural. Official doctrine offered checklists and thresholds, but it could not account for every variable now in play. Each pilot interpreted the guidance through the lens of his own circumstances. The senior pilot reduced power further, accepting a gradual descent in airspeed to stretch remaining fuel. His calculations suggested that if land was ahead, even marginally, this choice might be enough. If it was not, the additional minutes gained would at least allow for a controlled ditching under known conditions. He reviewed emergency procedures methodically: flap settings, approach speed, harness tightness, raft deployment. These steps were familiar from training, but their relevance now carried a different weight. There was no sense of panic, only focus. In the second aircraft, the engine finally crossed from irregular to unreliable. A sustained drop in power forced the pilot to lower the nose to maintain airspeed. Altitude decreased gradually. He attempted to restore power, but the response was inconsistent. The decision point arrived without drama, but with clarity. Continued flight would only delay the inevitable while reducing control. He transmitted a final brief message indicating loss of reliable power and intention to ditch. Whether the transmission was received was uncertain. There was no confirmation. He adjusted his heading slightly, aiming into the prevailing swell as best he could determine in the fading light. The younger pilot's turning point was less defined, but no less significant. His fuel gauges reached a level that training had marked as the point of no return. Continuing to search for land without confirmation now posed greater risk than a deliberate ditching while conditions were still manageable. He attempted one final series of radio calls on multiple frequencies. The result was the same: static, indistinct signals, no intelligible reply. The absence of response was not proof that no one was listening, but it could not be ignored. All three pilots now faced the same fundamental reality.
The aircraft that had carried them safely for hundreds of miles could no longer be relied upon to complete the mission. The ocean below, once a distant backdrop, was about to become their immediate environment. The senior pilot made his decision incrementally. When the engine coughed under reduced power and fuel pressure fluctuated, he concluded that delaying further offered no advantage. He transmitted his intention to ditch, then focused entirely on flying the aircraft to the water under control. The second pilot was already descending. His engine failed completely minutes after his last transmission. The propeller windmilled briefly, then slowed. With no power available, his options narrowed to gliding toward a chosen patch of water. He adjusted his approach to align with what he judged to be the swell direction, relying on training rather than visual certainty. The younger pilot followed a similar process, though his engine continued to run. He reduced power deliberately, trading airspeed for a controlled descent. He chose a heading that minimized cross-swell impact based on the limited cues available. His decision was not driven by immediate failure, but by the recognition that control now was preferable to uncertainty later. Each ditching occurred in isolation, separated by miles of open ocean and minutes of time. There was no coordination between the pilots. They could not see one another, and none knew precisely where the others were. The Pacific absorbed each aircraft without witness. The senior pilot's landing was controlled but forceful. The aircraft skipped once, then dug in, shedding speed rapidly. Water surged over the nose. He followed procedures instinctively, releasing harness and reaching for the raft release as the cockpit flooded. The second pilot's ditching was more abrupt. Without power, his descent angle was steeper. The aircraft struck the water hard, the impact tearing loose sections of the airframe. He was thrown forward against his restraints, then released himself as water rushed in. The structure began to sink almost immediately. The younger pilot's landing fell between the two in severity. His controlled approach reduced impact forces, but the aircraft still suffered significant damage. The fuselage filled quickly. He exited through a side opening, deploying his raft as the aircraft settled. In all three cases, training proved effective. The pilots escaped their aircraft with injuries that were survivable. Rafts inflated, emergency equipment remained accessible. The immediate crisis of impact passed. What followed was a new phase of exposure, governed not by aviation procedures, but by the realities of survival at sea. Darkness enclosed the rafts. The sound of engines faded completely. The aircraft, once central to each pilot's world, disappeared beneath the surface. None of the pilots knew their exact position. None could be certain that their final transmissions had been received. Rescue, if it came, would depend on fragmentary information, delayed responses, and the chance alignment of search efforts with drifting rafts. The turning point had been reached quietly. No single failure had caused it. Instead, a series of small limitations, fuel uncertainty, navigation imprecision, mechanical wear, and communication gaps had converged. The result was not catastrophic in the air, but consequential on the water. As the night settled fully over the Pacific, 3 rafts drifted independently, carrying pilots who had done what doctrine allowed and then gone beyond it when doctrine no longer sufficed. The operational problem had become personal, measured now in endurance, exposure, and time.
Night imposed a different set of conditions than any the pilots had trained for in the air. Once clear of their sinking aircraft, each man confronted the immediate tasks of survival at sea, securing himself to the raft, retrieving emergency supplies, and orienting to a world without fixed reference points. The Pacific at night was not violent, but it was unyielding. Swell lifted and lowered the rafts rhythmically, erasing any sense of direction. The senior pilot conducted a systematic check of his equipment. His raft had inflated properly. The emergency radio beacon was intact but uncertain in range. Signal flares were present, though their usefulness depended entirely on being seen. He rationed water immediately, following guidance learned in training that assumed rescue might take days rather than hours. The sky was clear enough to reveal stars, but without a compass or chart, they offered little practical assistance. The second pilot, injured more severely during his ditching, faced additional constraints. His shoulder pain limited movement, making it difficult to secure loose equipment. He worked deliberately, aware that exhaustion could become as dangerous as injury. His raft sat lower in the water than ideal, suggesting minor leakage or uneven inflation. He adjusted his position repeatedly, attempting to maintain balance and reduce drag. The junior pilot's situation appeared more stable initially. His raft rode high, and his injuries were minor. He activated his signaling equipment according to procedure, then waited, listening for any sound that might indicate nearby aircraft or ships. The ocean remained silent except for wind and water. As hours passed, the limitations of rescue planning became evident. The last known positions of the aircraft were imprecise. Controllers ashore had received fragmented reports, some delayed or incomplete. Plotting these against expected routes produced search areas measured in hundreds of square miles. Available search assets were limited, tasked already with other operations. Doctrine emphasized the importance of immediate reporting and accurate position data. In practice, radio degradation and delayed decision points had eroded both. The pilot's transmissions, where received, reflected estimates rather than fixes. Ground controllers operating within established procedures could not narrow search zones sufficiently to guarantee rapid recovery. By the early hours of the morning, search efforts began in earnest. Aircraft were dispatched along probable return routes. Surface vessels were alerted where feasible. These actions reflected the Navy's commitment to recovery, but they also revealed systemic constraints. Search patterns were broad by necessity. Coordination between air and surface units was limited by distance and communication delays. On the water, the pilots experienced the first indications that survival would involve more than endurance. The ocean's surface was not empty. Bioluminescence traced the movement of small organisms around the rafts, illuminating the water with faint flashes. These lights, while visually striking, underscored the presence of marine life drawn to disturbance. The senior pilot noticed the first dark shapes hours before dawn. They were indistinct at first, passing beneath the raft and disappearing. He could not identify them with certainty, but their size and movement suggested large fish. Training had addressed the possibility of marine predators, advising minimal movement and avoidance of splashing. He complied, remaining still and conserving energy. In the second pilot's case, the approach of marine life was more pronounced. His raft's lower profile allowed water to wash over its edge occasionally. Each movement created ripples that attracted attention below. He felt the raft bump from beneath, a solid contact that was unmistakable. The guidance to remain calm was difficult to follow, but he did so, keeping limbs inside the raft and minimizing disturbance. The junior pilot encountered similar activity later. He observed a fin break the surface briefly several yards away, then vanish. The sight was brief, but it clarified the environment in which he now existed. Sharks were not an abstract possibility. They were present. The training guidance offered no method of control beyond stillness and patience. These encounters did not result in immediate attack. The predators circled, investigating, then moved on. Yet their presence altered the psychological balance of survival. The pilots could no longer think only in terms of time and exposure. Every movement required consideration. Simple tasks, such as adjusting equipment or repositioning for comfort, carried added risk. As daylight approached, visibility improved but offered little reassurance. The horizon revealed only water. No ships, no aircraft, no contrails. The sun's rise brought warmth but also glare, making it difficult to spot distant movement. The rafts drifted independently, carried by currents and wind that the pilots could neither predict nor control.
Aircraft began sweeping designated sectors after sunrise. Crews scanned the ocean methodically, but the scale of the search challenged even disciplined procedures. Rafts were small targets, their colors blended with sea and shadow. Signal devices required precise timing to be effective, and pilots on the water could not know when to deploy them optimally. The senior pilot sighted an aircraft once, far off and moving away. He fired a flare, uncertain whether it was seen. There was no response. The flare's brief arc ended without acknowledgement. He returned to waiting, aware that his limited signaling resources were being consumed. The second pilot's condition worsened as the day progressed. Dehydration set in quickly, compounded by injury. He rationed water strictly, taking minimal sips at intervals. His movements slowed. He focused on maintaining consciousness and preventing panic, both of which training had identified as critical. The junior pilot attempted to maintain morale through routine. He checked equipment at set intervals, monitored the raft's condition, and observed the sky for aircraft. This structure provided a measure of control in an otherwise passive situation. Yet even he could not ignore the growing realization that rescue was not imminent. At command levels, the disappearance of the 3 aircraft prompted review. Reports were compiled, timelines reconstructed, and communications logs examined. The initial assessments emphasized adherence to procedure. The pilots had flown assigned routes. They had reported concerns. Their actions did not deviate from doctrine in any obvious way. However, questions emerged quietly. Why had position reporting been insufficient? Why had rescue assets not been positioned closer to the extended patrol areas? Why did doctrine assume margins that were no longer reliable under expanded operational demands? These questions did not lead to immediate changes. The war imposed priorities that favored continued operations over systemic revision. Patrols continued. Search and rescue remained constrained by resources. The disappearance of 3 aircraft was recorded as an operational loss, tragic but not exceptional. For the pilots, the stakes continued to rise with each passing hour. Sun exposure intensified, salt water irritated skin and eyes. Hunger became noticeable. Sharks returned intermittently, their presence now a constant factor rather than a novelty. None of the pilots experienced direct attack, but the circling shapes and occasional bumps maintained tension. The senior pilot used his emergency radio beacon sparingly, aware that continuous transmission might exhaust the battery without increasing detection probability. He timed transmissions to coincide with what he estimated were peak search periods based on earlier patrol schedules. Whether this calculation aligned with actual search efforts was unknowable. The second pilot, weakened and in pain, relied increasingly on instinct rather than calculation. He conserved movement, focusing on survival in the present rather than planning. His raft drifted slowly, its course shaped by forces beyond his influence. The junior pilot faced a different challenge: isolation. With physical condition relatively stable, his primary adversary became time. Hours blended together. The absence of external cues made it difficult to mark progress. He fought against complacency, knowing that missed opportunities for signaling could be fatal. By the end of the second day adrift, all 3 pilots had reached the limits of what training and preparation could mitigate. Survival now depended on variables outside their control: search patterns, chance sightings, and the endurance of their bodies and equipment. The system that had launched them had fulfilled its immediate requirements. Aircraft had flown, patrols had been conducted, losses had been recorded. What remained unresolved was the human cost of operating at the edge of capability, where doctrine lagged behind reality. The pilots continued to wait, exposed to sun by day and uncertainty by night, surrounded by an ocean that neither threatened nor protected them. Authority and procedure had done what they could. What remained was endurance,
chance, and the hope that someone, somewhere, would narrow the search enough to find 3 small rafts drifting in an immense sea.
The third morning after the ditchings began with the same elements that had defined the pilot's ordeal so far: sun, water, and waiting. Yet conditions, both physical and institutional, had shifted enough to alter the outcome. Search operations had expanded overnight. Analysis teams ashore had refined probability plots by combining last known transmissions, estimated fuel exhaustion points, prevailing winds, and surface current data. These calculations did not produce certainty, but they narrowed search sectors. Aircraft crews were briefed to fly lower and slower, accepting reduced coverage in exchange for improved detection. Shortly after mid-morning, a patrol aircraft flying one such revised track spotted an irregular shape against the glare. The sighting was tentative at first, easily dismissed as debris or wave pattern. The crew circled, descended, and confirmed that the object was a life raft. Signal panels were visible. Movement inside the raft confirmed a survivor. The raft belonged to the senior pilot. He had conserved enough strength to deploy a signal device when the aircraft passed overhead the second time. The flare burned briefly but clearly. The patrol aircraft radioed the sighting, dropped smoke, and marked the position. A surface vessel was diverted, arriving hours later to recover him from the water. The pilot was dehydrated, sunburned, and exhausted, but alive. He was treated aboard ship and later evacuated to shore. His debrief was factual and restrained. He described fuel uncertainty, radio degradation, and the decision to ditch when margins disappeared. There was no attempts to assign blame. His account matched procedures as written, even as it exposed their limits. Recovery of the second pilot occurred later that day, under less favorable circumstances. A search aircraft detected debris first, then located a raft drifting nearby. The pilot inside was barely conscious. His injuries and dehydration had progressed significantly. He was recovered by surface vessel and given immediate medical care. Despite treatment, his condition remained critical for days. He survived, though his recovery was prolonged. His debrief emphasized engine unreliability, delayed reporting, and the difficulty of balancing mechanical caution against the need to maintain progress. His account added detail to the technical picture, particularly regarding how marginal engine behavior could persist long enough to encourage delay, then fail decisively. The junior pilot was found last. His raft had drifted farther than projected, carried by a combination of wind and current that models had underestimated. He had continued signaling intermittently, preserving flares until aircraft appeared likely. When spotted, he was alert and responsive, though visibly weakened. His rescue closed the operational chapter. 3 pilots had gone down. 3 had been recovered. No enemy action had been involved. No dramatic last-minute interventions had occurred. The outcome rested on extended search effort, revised assumptions, and a degree of chance that could not be eliminated. In the days that followed, the Navy conducted routine investigations. Aircraft maintenance records were reviewed, communications logs were examined, navigation planning procedures were rechecked. Official findings concluded that the pilots had acted within established doctrine. Mechanical issues were categorized as contributing factors rather than primary causes. Navigation error was acknowledged but framed as an inherent risk of long-range operations. No disciplinary action was taken. No formal commendations were issued beyond standard recognition for survival and endurance. The incident was recorded as a reminder of operational risk rather than a catalyst for immediate change. Yet quiet adjustments followed. Patrol planning incorporated more conservative fuel margins where possible. Emphasis was placed on earlier reporting of discrepancies, even if minor. Search and rescue coordination procedures were refined incrementally, focusing on faster correlation of incomplete position data. None of these changes were announced publicly or attributed to a single incident. For the pilots, the aftermath unfolded differently. The senior pilot returned to flight status after recovery. His subsequent assignments remained operational, though he was noted by peers for a heightened attention to planning margins and contingencies. He did not speak often of the ditching, but when he did, his focus remained on systems rather than personal hardship. The second pilot's injuries ended his flying career. He remained in naval service in a non-flying capacity, contributing to training and technical roles.
His experience informed discussions about engine monitoring and reporting thresholds, though these insights circulated informally rather than as official doctrine. The junior pilot continued flying for the remainder of the war. His survival reinforced his confidence in training, but also left him aware of its limitations. He later described the experience not as extraordinary, but as an example of how ordinary procedures could lead to extraordinary exposure when margins disappeared. None of the three became widely known. Their names did not enter popular histories of the Pacific War. Their ordeal did not feature in official summaries of major operations. It remained a small entry in operational loss records, footnoted by recovery reports. The broader institutional response reflected wartime priorities. The Pacific Campaign continued to expand. Patrol ranges increased further. Losses occurred elsewhere. Some recovered, many not. The system adapted gradually, shaped by accumulated experience rather than singular events. What distinguished this incident was not heroism in the conventional sense, but endurance within constraint. The pilots did not defy orders or improvise dramatically. They followed procedures until those procedures no longer resolved their situation, then relied on training and judgment to survive. The presence of sharks, later noted in debriefs and reports, did not alter official conclusions. It was acknowledged as an environmental hazard, one among many. Yet for the pilots, it remained a defining element of the experience, shaping every decision made on the raft. Survival was not abstract. It was immediate, physical, and constant. In the years after the war, advancements in navigation, communication, and rescue coordination reduced the likelihood of similar incidents. Improved radio coverage, more accurate fuel measurement, and dedicated rescue assets closed some of the gaps exposed in 1943. These changes were cumulative, the product of many experiences rather than one. The three pilots returned to civilian life carrying a shared but largely unspoken history. Their story was not of victory or defeat, but of exposure at the edge of capability. It illustrated how war tested not only weapons and strategy, but assumptions about reliability, distance, and risk. Their experience remains a reminder that much of the war was fought not in decisive engagements, but in routine operations stretched thin by scale. The Pacific was vast. Aircraft were finite. Margins mattered. If this account added to your understanding of the quiet risks carried by those who flew routine missions far from attention, consider supporting the preservation of these overlooked histories by subscribing to the channel and sharing the story.